Investor Intelligence provides general information only. You should consider seeking independent advice to see how this information relates to your unique circumstances. Please refer to the terms and conditions available at investorintelligence.com.au for more.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Investor Intelligence, brought to you by the team at the Property Mentors. It's your weekly podcast for all things investment and hosted by me, Phoebe Sikowski-Wallace. So joining me for today's episode is our very own investment expert, Luke Harris. Fancy seeing you here, Luke.
Yes, thank you, Phoebe. Good to be back.
So, Luke, the RBA released their announcement last week. Can you give us a quick rundown on what's happened and what's changed there?
Well, surprise, surprise, interest rates have gone up again. And this is the 10th consecutive rise. And,
Shocking.
This is really the highest they've been for the last 11 years. So it is quite an interesting time for us to be in right now. And I know we talk about interest rates a lot, but the last RBA announcement was basically highlighting the fact that inflation is getting a little bit out of control and they need to bring that back into a normal range, which is in their normal target range. So interest rates seems to be the only tool that they've got available to do that, and that's what they're using to slow down consumer spending.
And that normal range, where is that usually sitting again?
Well, generally, we're looking at overall long-term interest rates for the retail market at around 7%, which is, still a little bit higher than where we are today. A lot of people have actually seen, interest rates at much higher rates, up to 18% many, many years ago. And we've seen rates for, 9%, 8%. That people have been paying on their mortgages. And so what people that have bought in the last 5 or 6 or 7 years have really bought into a time that is historically the lowest rates we've ever seen. So home buyers and investors that have bought in the last few years really haven't seen them at these current rates, and that's why there's a lot of mortgage stress out there at the moment.
Yeah. So we recently released an episode on inflation, what it is sort of more broadly, and why interest rates are used to try and control and tackle inflation. So today I kind of wanted to talk to you about how inflation impacts more specifically the property market. So, Luke, when it comes to property, we know inflation affects house prices, but is it just house prices that are affected, or are there other aspects to consider?
Well, obviously, inflation affects all areas of the economy, but unfortunately, it hasn't affected wage increase. A lot of people have noticed that the cost of living has gone up dramatically. In particular, food has gone up a huge amount in the last few years. Overheads that people have in their households, such as electricity and gas, insurance costs have gone up for cars and homes and other things. And so inflation really is affecting the cost of living, but it hasn't actually helped with any wage growth at all. Wage growth has been relatively stagnant, and that's really causing a lot of stress for people.
So what's happening there as opposed to last time we've been in a situation where interest rates have started to go up, or inflation started to go up? What's happening as far as wage increases?
Well, I think wage increases have been stagnant for some time because of the fact that obviously we've just come out of the pandemic and there's been a lot of restructuring and a lot of businesses that have really suffered through that business, and we certainly weren't immune to that. Our businesses were affected by COVID at different levels to other businesses, but in every sector there have been businesses impacted by COVID, and that's meant restructures, extra costs for retaining staff during COVID for those that were able to do that. A lot of businesses had to close, but a lot of businesses stayed open and retained their staff and traded through. And a lot of businesses still, essentially paying that off. And it is a tricky time out there for businesses. And obviously costs of, like I said, insurances and other things have been continually going up. And in some businesses, in particular the building sector that we've seen. There's been shortages of labour. There's been shortages of materials for building houses and so forth, and a lot of those costs, as we've seen through the media, with builders going bust and developers going broke and so forth, is because they've committed to prices that they literally cannot build them for. Timber prices have gone up by 60, 70% in some cases. Cable and other things that are required to build homes have gone through the roof, and even the roof has gone through the roof. So, the cost of everything to put a building together has gone up, and, people are really struggling to, navigate through that, especially in the building industry. So really when it comes down to how it's affected wage growth has been stagnant through this time. And what's happened though is that we've continued to spend money regardless, and this is driving inflation. And we're looking at the RBA and how they're responding to this, and the only tool that they've got really to curb inflation is to put interest rates up. And we've got to be mindful of the fact that they're not done yet. They said in their recent announcement that they were looking to potentially pause for a little while, but a lot of the commentators out there talking about interest rates are saying, well, whilst they might talk about pausing, it's likely that we're still in for another couple of rate rises this year. And the other thing to keep in mind is that we're still a full 1% behind where the US interest rates are. They're sitting at around 4.5% at the moment, and we're 1% behind that. So we often follow what the US does as far as their economy and how things are done. And we really are still in a relatively affordable interest rate period. I know that's going to sound odd to some people, but if you look at the long-term average in Australia, we're still below the long-term average. It's just that there has been a lot of mortgage shock and a lot of stress caused by people, more so that have either borrowed too much or that have borrowed for the first time during the last 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, definitely. So when interest rates and inflation are high, what kind of behaviours do we sort of see in the market? And following on from that, does it kind of change whether they're investors or if they're homeowners?
Well, yeah, investors and homeowners are, they're all affected by it, and obviously tenants are affected as well. But when the sort of behaviours that we see really by this is around people's cost of living going up. So they try and curb that spending by increasing interest rates, but a lot of people have sort of been living a certain lifestyle, and it takes a little while for people to adjust. Now, one of the things that people can do when their household budget needs a review, if people are struggling with payments on either their investments or their owner-occupied debt, or even just the credit card or their overall expenses, it's a good time to sit down and do the family budget again. Look at your options about where your money's going. Make sure you understand where your money's going and see if there's any efficiencies that can be made. I mean, Victoria and I believe New South Wales were doing this as well. The government's paying $250 to people just to do a review of their electricity bill. So if you can just do a quick Google search, it's basically do a review of your electricity bill, see if there's a cheaper option out there. And just for doing that, it takes 5 minutes on the website. They will bank $250 into your bank account. So there's money for nothing for everybody on the call.
Yeah, some of the easiest money you'll make for sure.
That's it. And it literally is only 5 minutes. You put your electricity bill details in there. There's no cost, and there's certainly nothing to sign up for. And if you can find a better deal on your electricity, fantastic, then you can switch over. But have a look in your own state or territory as to whether your governments are actually offering that. I know that Victoria, I believe at the end of this month, they've got a new round happening. They did it last year and they're doing it again this year. But have a look in your state or territory and see if they've got that. But what we often see is that people tend to take a little while to adjust their spending. So what happens is interest rates go up a little bit. People think they can deal with it. They keep spending at the same levels. Interest rates go up again. They might slow down a little bit. But it takes several rate rises for people to actually slow down with their spending. And it's really that discretionary spending where people, go out to the movies or go out for a dinner. Instead of going out a couple of times a week, they might drop that back down to once a week or once a fortnight. And that's really the effect that we're seeing. And essentially, repayments on your average home loan have risen by 50%. since April 2022. I mean, that's not even a full year, and people's rates have gone up by repayments. Have gone up by 50%. So the average mortgage holder out there is actually coughing up quite a bit of extra money to cover these interest rate rises. So that's going to have an effect at some point. Like I said, we're probably expecting a couple of interest rate rises before things calm down a little bit.
Yeah, it really is a surefire way to assess what kind of spending habits you have, hey, and where you need to cut back. But you're right, that would take many people a little bit of time to adjust those spending habits.
Well, I think the reality is that if the RBA doesn't get inflation under control, it can do the opposite and get out of control, and that can mean some bigger issues for the economy down the road a little bit further. So as much as people don't like rates going up, and I certainly don't like paying extra for my many mortgages, but at the end of the day, they are doing what they need to do. And it is a sensible option. People don't necessarily agree with that, and they're, essentially, a lot of people are pretty angry with the RBA and also with the banks. But the reality is that inflation is here on our doorstep, and they have to do these things and take these measures. Otherwise, there are bigger problems ahead.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a good time to adopt some good money habits for sure. So speaking of COVID before, during COVID, we saw the property market boom. Which would have obviously had an impact on inflation over the last few years. Do you think what we're seeing at the moment is almost like a natural correction from the impact of COVID?
Look, interesting question. I think, the thing that we've got to look at during COVID, during 2020 and 21, and through a good part of 2022, developers and landowners, and also homeowners, first home buyers, a lot of people sat on the sidelines during those 2.5 years. And what that meant was that we weren't in a normal property market. Prior to that, 2018, 2019, the markets were ticking along, doing what they need to do. People were buying and selling and transacting property. Developers were putting together projects, and they were starting developments, and really in a normal, healthy property market. There were markets that were doing better than others and others that weren't performing as well. But overall, we were in a relatively normal, stable property market. Now, 2020 hit. That changed everything. It really did throw the biggest spanner in the works that we've seen, at least for the last handful of decades, 50 years or so. We've never seen anything that has affected property markets for as long as the COVID periods did. So when we saw the property markets boom, that was partly due to what was happening prior to COVID, but also because a lot of people sat on the sidelines. Now, when COVID sort of started settling down towards the end of 2021 and into 22, people thought maybe it's safe to dip my toes in the water again and get back out there. And yes, that has had an effect on inflation. But obviously with developers and builders not starting new developments, prior to COVID, we were in a housing shortage across this country, that we weren't building enough homes. And what this has done, the last, essentially taking 80 to 90% of new developments out of that market during a 2.5 year period has meant there's been an insane shortage of properties being built. And as we've seen through the media for the last 12 months or more, with a lot of builders going under, a lot of developers going under, that's put further supply pressures into the market. And of course, we've got to look at the supply chain issues that we've seen as well, with a shortage of materials. There's been a shortage of timber and cables and pipes and other materials that people need for building. And of course, that has slowed down a normal construction cycle. So all of these things combined have meant, rising costs on materials, rising costs on labour. There's been delays and builders going broke. Plus there was a period where 2.5 years or so, there was no new starting. And we're talking in general terms, there was new development starting, mind you, but a huge portion of what would normally happen in a market was put on hold. So when we come out of that, moving into the start of 2023, we simply don't have enough new homes coming onto the market to meet the demand. The other thing to see, as an impact from COVID is that a lot of international students left, and they went home and they sort of packed up and got out of Australia and went back to their families, and obviously studying was different and everything went online. What's happening now is that China and India China in particular, have changed their rules recently to make sure that their students can't study online anymore. They have to actually go to the university. So we're expecting around 40,000 students to come into Australia in the next few months, for the balance of this year. And that's really going to put more pressure onto the housing markets, especially in the inner city areas, in the apartment market, which was really decimated during COVID, especially in places like Melbourne. And with those students coming back into the market, along with the natural migration into the bigger cities around the country, is going to put further pressure on housing.
Yeah, so we're going to be seeing a lot of competition, I guess, to get into a house.
We're seeing it now, and people that are looking for a new property that's completed, people are paying a lot of money for those properties because people want to live in a newer property. But we're also seeing areas that traditionally haven't performed well that have started to perform extremely well, and we're really starting to see that critical mass, especially in places like Sydney. We've seen a lot of growth in Brisbane since COVID. Obviously, a lot of people did move from the southern states and move north. The Gold Coast has done insanely well. Mind you, some of these markets hadn't performed that well for a decade prior to that. So, we've got to look at these things in perspective. And also at the moment, Adelaide's going through a bit of a boom because, again, for a decade prior to that, there wasn't a huge amount of new construction. And affordability is a big key thing as well. With this AUKUS agreement and, submarines and so forth being built in South Australia for the next couple of decades, that's going to bring employment. And a lot of people are suggesting that that's partly to do with Adelaide's price rises. But at the same time, if they haven't been building anything for the last decade, the East Coast has been very, very expensive to get into, especially with interest rates rising. Adelaide then becomes, attractive again, and people are starting to move there for the lifestyle and for the affordable housing. So it is a very interesting time to be in the property markets. Things are going to stabilise, especially once we see the RBA pausing for a little while, and we will, see some sort of normalisation over the next 6 months.
So as a long-time property investor, Luke, what's your instinct when it comes to the market we're sort of seeing at the moment?
Well, I think to answer that, for me, it's business as usual. When we're looking at a long-term property investment, I guess my instinct is just to keep doing what I'm doing because it's working. And this is what we teach our members here at the Property Mentors as well, is that, our long-term approach to investing means that we just adapt our strategy accordingly. We can't control interest rates. We can't control inflation. We can't control what the US, the Russian, the Chinese, or the Australian government do. These things are going to happen around the world anyway. All we can look at is our own individual goals, our own individual plan of attack on how we're building our portfolio, and of course, how we're going to, set ourselves up for the future using property as the vehicle to get there. And I do expect that in 2023, we will see some, either late this year or early next year, we'll start seeing some rate drops, and we'll start getting back to some sort of a normal market. Of course, we never know what the future holds as far as global impacts or anything else that could be happening with. We've obviously got Russia and Ukraine. There's issues with China and Taiwan. We've got obviously banks collapsing in the US, and there is a lot of international factors that can affect things like interest rates and our economy. But as an investor, we've just got to make sure we're focusing on our own investment goals and not freaking out every time something happens on the news, and just making sure that we're looking at things in perspective. Things are going to get in the way. There's going to be interest rate changes and inflation. Changes to your job situation, all these things are going to happen, and that's part of life. But it's how we manage these things along the way that's going to help us to be successful.
Yeah, definitely. So thank you for sharing that. And seeing as it is a bit of a time to start saving, if you need some guidance managing your spending, we recommend listening to our podcast episode, Being a Tight Ass in Tough Times. Trust me, you'll get something good out of that. But thank you for listening. I'll be back in your ears again next week. As always, thank you so much for your time today, Luke.
Thanks, Phoebe. Have a great day.
If you found this episode or any of our episodes helpful, please make sure to share and leave a rating to help us reach more people on their investing journeys. And of course, subscribe to be notified when new episodes drop. Make sure to follow the podcast on Instagram at Investor Intelligence Podcast. You can find links to our other socials in the show notes, including a link to the Property Mentors weekly blog. If you're ready to get your property portfolio in shape for financial freedom, check out Luke's latest book, Property Fit. You can get yourself a copy at www.propertyfitbook.com.au.